And right now, a wonderful guest joins us in the studio, Si Rogers. Good morning, Si. How are you?
Oh, I'm glad to be back in Australia, back here in Adelaide especially.
We're very pleased to have you here.
Thank you.
You've had a long journey, but it's kind of become almost a second home, that aeroplane, hasn't it?
That's right, and the airplane taking me here to Australia. This is my 19th year of traveling to Australia, and having lived in New Zealand and Singapore too, it's always given me proximity, so it's just almost a second home. I quite enjoy being back in country. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Now, Si, you're here to have a couple of meetings at Northside Christian Life Centre out at Gawler, and that's on tomorrow and Sunday as well. But we thought we'd nab you first and get a bit of an Essence exclusive. Si, your journey's been a very interesting one, and you're going to be sharing some of your journey over the weekend, I'm sure.
Yes.
But you've said that your life is not it's more about being under construction or people in progress, that idea.
Yeah.
And I think that's very helpful, because a lot of us think, okay, if I can just get to this point, then I'll be fine.
Right.
You get there and kind of go, oh, whoops.
Yes, then you climb out of one ditch and find that you're in yet another ditch.
Right.
And I think it's Rick Warren, the famous American pastor from Saddleback Church in the Los Angeles area, who said life is really just going from one problem to the next.
That's very encouraging, isn't it?
Very encouraging. But I think that a lot of us kind of live in the illusion that, certainly as an American, we're taught that happiness is our highest goal, and that I should be able to conquer every obstacle to health and wealth and happiness, and God should help me achieve that too. And when God doesn't make it play out that way, people get kind of bent and bitter and twisted and think, well, how come this doesn't work? And I thought it should be better than this. And that sharply exposes these mistaken worldviews. When life on earth is a big challenge, and yet there is growth, there is progress made. Problems don't have to control a life or dominate in the way that they have. And I'm, back in country, being able to share in seminar and in these various meetings insights from my own journey, not just as a caregiver for almost 30 years, but as a man who's got to practice everything I preach and teach to other people.
I read, you were talking about change, and I read a beautiful prayer. I don't know if you're familiar with the cartoonist Lunig. Okay, I've got a book that says A Cartoonist Talks to God. And this is the prayer. It's just beautiful. God, help us to change ourselves and to change our world, to know the need for it, to deal with the pain of it, to feel the joy of it, to undertake the journey without understanding the destination, the art of gentle revolution.
Wow. Well said.
Well, thank you. But that was him.
And he did it really well. And I got to say, it does play into a little adage that I like to promote to people, that change is really not your goal. Change is the inevitability of growth. If you grow, then things will change. The 5-year-old doesn't fret, wringing their hands about how will they possibly become 15. They will become 15. Development, kicked off at conception, continues its path. But certainly whether you are nourished or whether you are damaged or mended has impact upon that growth that does result in change. And a lot of people do find they get stuck. They've been starved of love, they've been wounded in life, and their desire to move forward is compromised. And so, in my journey of mending with my own humanity and dealing with that for the last 30 years doesn't mean that I think I've arrived and that I know everything, but it's given me some perspective, that retrospect, where I can look back and see the principles and the patterns that have worked to bring transformation into my life, that gentle transformation that didn't happen with a magic wand as much as I wished it were so, but which, nevertheless, I can say I may not be where, I think I ought, but boy, I sure am a lot further than I ever imagined. And I've learned a lot about myself and about my faith and about humanity, and maybe that's why it's supposed to be like that.
So could you give us a little insight into your journey?
Sure. I guess to put it in a nutshell, I came from a broken home, as many people do, and I had a mom who was much more than an alcoholic, but she was that, and she couldn't nurture me like a kid needs. And then through her own bad choice-making, she got involved in an affair with a man who began to sexually violate me as a child. It's approximately, in Western culture, it's probably true all over the world, but we quantify these things better in the first world. About 1 in every 4 women and 1 in every 6 men is sexually violated before the age of 16. Wow. And so for me, that brought about a lot of confusion and a lot of anger and a lot of shame. I felt very like dirty, damaged merchandise. I felt inferior. And it also taught me things about sex I should have never known. And then growing up where I did, my mother was killed in a car wreck, driving accident, and then I was separated from my father, and like all little boys who need father's investment, I didn't get it. And being raised by women, I picked up on their mannerisms, and of course in the American conservative macho Midwest, because I didn't conform to the standard, I got picked on and alienated. And so by the time I reached adulthood, the only kind of relationships I knew with men men. They either wanted to exploit me or abuse me or reject me. So I hungered for masculine love, and so you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand how vulnerable I was to exploitation that eventually led me into homosexual relationships. And I lived that life for a number of years, and even attempted to have a sex change at one point, not because I was convinced I should have been a woman, but I did feel convinced I had failed as a male. And so I'm glad, though, that while living as a woman in preparation for surgery, I never had that operation, because I had literally an experience with God that, for listeners who may not know what that feels like, I did not know what that felt like either. I grew up thinking I knew everything about all that Christian stuff, and I didn't have a very good attitude toward church culture. I didn't have a good attitude toward organized religion, and certainly not toward God, whom I blamed as the author of my suffering. I did believe in him out there somewhere, but I thought he wasn't a very nice person. So, at the end of the day, I guess there's a big difference between what you think you know about God versus an experience that literally shook me up, opened my eyes to his reality. And I said to my friends, he's no longer a code of ethics to debate. He's not some ideological point of view or some spiritual option on the big religious buffet of choice. This is a tangible entity. I can't touch him tangibly, but I feel him tangibly affect me. When I feel dirty, he makes me feel clean. When I feel looked down upon by others and rejected or looked at with contempt, he makes me feel valued and wanted. Whenever I'm afraid, he gives me this sense of peace and presence that I can't touch it tangibly, but I feel him affect me, and I have to have more of that. For if he's real, then what am I going to do with my life? How am I going to live it? What choices am I going to make? Now, I can assure you, Kari, I never imagined I would live any other way than I was living. But when my eyes got open to God, it pivoted me, not like, oh, I'm going to go be straight and try to conform to some societal standard. I didn't think that, but I began to rein in my sexuality and submit it to God. I still struggled with, temptations, attractions, desires. After all, I'd spent years cultivating those. When I was lonely, or whenever I was bored, or whenever I was lusting, for some intimacy, I would act on it. I'd never controlled my appetites. They controlled me. Mm-hmm. And now I could talk to God honestly and say, yeah, God, I want that. But you know what? I want you more. Help me. And as I began my spiritual journey and reading scripture and going to church, I began to grow in ways I did not anticipate. And eventually, to make the long story short, as a lot of the damage was healed in my wounded heart over time and with counseling, and as I began to retrain that brain and put off old patterns that used to control me, just because somebody cuts you off in traffic, you don't have to flip them the bird and yell and scream. There are different ways to cope with stress in life that are not so destructive or useless. And as I began to retrain my brain and find healing for my wounded heart, and as I began to get loved by people without having to be sexual with them, I began to grow. And as you grow, things change. And what was once undesirable and unattainable became both. So today, I feel good in my skin as a man. I will never live like my past never happened, but I have enjoyed being married for almost a quarter of a century.
Fantastic.
I enjoy being a father. I have an adult family now. That doesn't prove I'm not gay, but, it's evidence of a life of growth, that as you grow, things change. So it's kind of like having moved from one country, now living in another. I'll never forget where I came from. Mm-hmm. I'll never forget the language of that place, but I don't live there now. And I've enjoyed a new life of growth beyond the past. And it's not about the gay thing, but it is about the God thing, and living a life controlling your appetites rather than being controlled. Living a life beyond just the satisfaction of your appetites, I think, for me in that regard. And that really released me to experience what I never imagined I could. Mm. So when I talk about growth and I talk about damage, I understand what that feels like, but I also know what it feels like to see wounds mend, needs met, and growth that leads to that gentle transformation.
Fantastic. So when we come back, I would like to talk about why is the church so hung up on sexual issues, and also what about guys who've kind of jumped through all the hoops. They've grown up, they've got the house, they've got the 2 cars, the 3.4 kids, they've got the wife, but there's stuff inside that they just don't know how to deal with, and they don't feel they can actually say anything because of the fallout of if they admit that. So there are a couple of things for you to think about. We'll be back with more in a moment on Life FM.